Welcome to Exhausting Stories, where history helps you drift into sleep. Tonight, we return to the winter of 1349, a time when silence blanketed the world. The Black Death had swept across Europe. Villages were empty, fires cold, laughter gone. A few remained, wondering why they had been spared. What was it like to live through such a winter? To wake each day in a world that no longer felt alive? We'll step gently into their world, not to fear, but to understand, to feel the stillness, the quiet resilience, the fading echoes of those who endured. You enjoy being carried softly through time. Subscribe and let history whisper you to sleep. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. It really makes a difference in the algorithm. Now, cozy up by the fire. Its warmth. Let it calm your thoughts. Let the story begin. Imagine the hum of activity filling every corner of a small medieval village, the kind built on cooperation and the rhythm of the seasons. The day begins with the ringing of church bells, not just a call to prayer, but a gentle signal for the village to awaken. Farmers push open the wooden shutters of their homes, stepping into crisp morning air with tools slung over their shoulders. The fields just beyond the clusters of simple cottages are alive with motion. Men tilling the soil and women gathering herbs along the hedgerows, their voices carrying faintly over the landscape. Set against the backdrop of thatched rooftops and timber-framed houses, the blacksmith's forge becomes the heartbeat of the village. The steady clang of iron on iron sends sparks flying as he shapes tools and horseshoes, his sleeves rolled back and face glistening from the heat. Children gather at the edge of his shop, wide-eyed as the glowing metal transforms under his hammer. Meanwhile, down by the communal ovens, a group of women kneads dough, their hands strong and deft as they work to feed their families and neighbors. The scent of baking bread mingles with the earthy aroma of the fields, creating a warm, familiar atmosphere that wraps around the village like a soft blanket. Everywhere you turn, life teems with purpose. A shepherd and his flock cross through the village square, his dog faithfully at his side. Chickens cluck noisily, scratching at the dust near market stalls, where merchants arrange their wares. Pottery, woven baskets, fresh vegetables, all proudly displayed as bartering fills the morning air with snippets of conversation. Laughter breaks through when a group of boys dashes past, chasing each other around the square, their shouts echoing against the grey stone walls of the parish church. It's a place where connections between people are necessary and strong. Villagers rely on one another not just for goods, but for daily survival. When a cart breaks down on the uneven dirt road, two men wordlessly step forward to repair it, while others pause their tasks to lend a hand. In winter, firewood is shared without question. In spring, the first harvests are celebrated together, each success made sweeter by the collective effort that led to it. The bonds of this small community create a kind of safety net, a system where no one is left entirely on their own. In this way, shared spaces define the village. The well at its center, for example, is more than just a source of water. It's a place where roles and lives overlap. Women gather to exchange news while filling their buckets, and young lovers linger shyly, stealing glances between the adults' chatter. But it's not just the lively routines and familiar patterns that make this village feel alive. It's the stories carried in every corner. Within those cottages, lit only by the soft flicker of firelight at night, generations have lived and passed down memories. You can imagine them, sitting on low wooden stools, telling tales of knights and saints, of strange happenings in far-off lands, and weaving these narratives into the fabric of their own community. The youngest children sit transfixed, their faces alight with wonder, as the sounds of the outside world fade into stillness beyond the sturdy walls. Life in this village hums not only with joy, but with its own challenges and routines. There's hard labor from sun-up to sundown, and the seasons rule the pace of daily life. Winters are unforgiving, with simple meals stretched thin and wood gathered in haste before the snows arrive. Yet even in these times, there's something reliable about the rhythm of things, something comforting in the daily rituals that have existed for centuries. The year's hardships and blessings ebb and flow like the seasons themselves, creating an unshakable rhythm tied to the earth. But imagine, for a moment, the first whisper of change. It begins faintly, as faraway murmurings of illness carried by travelers and traders. These are rare visitors who bring not only spices and cloth, but stories of places beyond the village's borders. And in 1349, that soft murmur takes on a sharper edge. Perhaps at first, it's dismissed as the stuff of exaggeration, tales from distant cities where the sickness is said to sweep through like fire on dry grass. After all, in this quiet place, the routines of life hum on uninterrupted. Yet as weeks pass, the whispers grow louder, and unease begins to press itself into small, unnoticed spaces. There's talk now from the shepherd returning from a nearby town, or pilgrims stopping at the church, their words tinted with urgency. The sickness, it seems, is moving closer. And though life continues much as before, farmers planting their crops, children kicking up dirt as they run in circles, there's a collective glance over the shoulder, a sense that something unseen may already be here, just out of sight. What does it take for a village like this to begin to change? Not all at once, but slowly, like snow starting to fall, soft flakes that gather quietly until the landscape looks entirely unlike what it once was. Perhaps one day, you notice fewer visitors at the market. The blacksmith shop is quieter than before, his hammer striking less often. A neighbour's window, usually open to let in the fresh air, is shuttered tightly for days on end. Rumours swell where hearty laughter used to echo, and the sound of the church bell ringing feels heavier, as if signalling more than just another passing hour. All of it builds, little by little, like a thread being pulled from a sturdy fabric. Soon, it's not just a faint unease, but a chilling realization that this village, so alive with its shared spaces and habits, might never be the same. Life here was tightly woven, all parts connected, and every ordinary moment anchored in predictability. It was a place where the rhythms of life carried on, even during the hardest of winters. But in the shadow of what is to come, this fabric begins to fray. And yet, in this moment, the village still feels whole. For now, the women by the ovens brush flour from their hands and smile as they trade stories. Children roll hoops along the path leading to the church, their scarves trailing behind them in the brisk afternoon breeze. The forge remains a source of warmth, pulling in locals who simply want to exchange pleasantries with the blacksmith while feeling the heat of the fire on their faces. There's harmony in the way the villagers walk through their lives, never understanding how fragile the entire system truly is. Picture one final image, the sun dipping low beneath the horizon, casting long shadows over the village square. The market stalls have been folded up for the day, and the fields are now silent as twilight settles in. Smoke curls upward from chimneys, joining the heavier cloak of night. The church bell tolls one last time before fading into the quiet embrace of evening. Here, everything feels as it's always been, as though nothing could pull this way of life apart. But silence waits at the edges, the kind that belongs to the spaces between now and what's just ahead. As warmth and sound fill the heart of the village in its present, that silence will soon seep in, altering every corner. Life here has always been tied to shared rituals and thriving connections, but that delicate balance is already on the edge of collapse. The coming winter will hollow these streets, transform this square, and still the daily rhythms in a way too few will live to witness. For now, though, the faint outline of that eerie silence hasn't fully settled. The village exists in its last days of unbroken normalcy, the routines unchanged, the faces familiar. But tomorrow's air will be different. This precarious flicker of light, of life as it's been known here for generations, is one that will soon dim, leaving behind an echo of what once was. The wooden shutters will close for longer stretches, the smell of fresh bread will dissipate, and the laughter of children will fade, one sound at a time. And where the warmth of life once radiated across every corner of this place, the snowy stillness of 1349 will creep in. Conversations will end before they begin, and the forge will go cold. It will all unravel so quietly that it's hard to say exactly when the moment of change arrived. All that remains now is to wonder at what point did this village realize the world it had known was already slipping into its past. What did it feel like to witness the first signs of devastation in a village where every life mattered and no face was unknown? There wasn't a great crashing wave to announce the arrival of the Black Death, just a faint ripple at first. It began as news from distant places, vague reports of sickness in port cities like Messina, where death swept through within days of ships arriving. Stories came slowly, carried along trade routes by traveling merchants, pilgrims, or even weary soldiers returning home. At first, they sounded like tales from another world, detached and distant. But this other world's shadow soon stretched across Europe, and by the time the winter of 1349 arrived, the sickness had crept into the heart of even the smallest villages, slipping past thresholds, uninvited and unstoppable. The disease had moved remarkably fast. Historians often trace its path to trading ships, carrying not just silks and spices, but something far more sinister, fleas infected with Yersinia pestis. From ports, the sickness spread inland along trade paths, slipping from bustling towns to the smallest rural enclaves. The plague wasn't confined to the great urban centres, where you might expect disease to thrive. It seeped into the most isolated corners, carried on carts, in sacks of grain, or even by the travellers themselves. This small village, tucked far from the busy city hubs, seemed so unlikely a target at first. But the bonds that once tied the village to the outside world, the visiting merchants and wandering pilgrims, became its undoing. Those connections now ferried death straight to its gates. At first, it wasn't obvious what was happening. Someone's cough grew worse and worse, their pallor fading until they could no longer rise from their bed. The village priest might be called to administer last rites, but even he stumbled for words, unsure of what this sudden illness meant. Days passed, and more fell sick. Hushed voices murmured about chills, fevers, swellings under the arms or in the groin, dark, hateful lumps that no poultice or prayer could remove. Somebody died with alarming speed. Another followed. The whispers grew louder, panic inching closer as more and more neighbours failed to open their doors in the morning. That sense of tight-knit community, always a source of security, suddenly felt suffocating. How could you avoid it when everyone you knew shared the same paths, the same wells, the same air? The rhythm of daily life, once so reliable, began to stutter and falter. At first, there were half-hearted attempts to carry on as usual. The blacksmith still lit his forge. The women still gathered near the ovens to bake. Children still ran across the square, though fewer each day. But the tension in the air was undeniable, creeping into every gesture, every glance. People avoided standing too close. A slight cough from a merchant at the edge of the market could silence a crowd. And when the church bell tolled, the sound that once signified the familiar cycle of time now carried a different weight, an unmistakable reminder of how many funerals it had rung for. When the dead began to outnumber the living, the village changed entirely. Early on, burials followed the old ways. A procession led through the streets, the priest at the head murmuring blessings. Family and friends walked not far behind, holding candles and saying their prayers. The deceased was laid to rest with dignity, lowered into the soft earth under the watchful gaze of the entire community. But this tradition quickly buckled under the weight of sheer necessity. As more succumbed to the sickness, there simply wasn't enough time or enough hands to lay each body to rest in its own grave. So a field on the edge of the village was chosen, and there the graves were dug hastily, deeper and wider than before, each one meant to hold more than a single body. Those left standing clung to whatever explanations they could find. Medieval medicine, limited as it was, offered little in the way of answers. Some spoke of miasma, foul air said to carry sickness from place to place. Villagers began to burn herbs like rosemary and lavender, hoping the fragrant smoke might cleanse the air and keep the sickness away. Others saw the disease as a punishment from God for sins great and small. The priests' sermons grew darker, filled with warnings of wrath and repentance. Meanwhile, some whispered about witches or strangers or anything else their minds could latch onto in the struggle to understand. Fear bred suspicion, and even in this once tight-knit village, neighbors began to eye one another warily, keeping their distance, not out of courtesy, but out of a quiet, gnawing terror. For all the theories, though, nothing really helped. The sickness came without warning, striking some down in hours, others over the course of just 2 or 3 days. There was no way to predict who it would touch next, and that unpredictability added to the dread. One family might be entirely spared, while their neighbor's house fell silent in the space of a week. The sheer randomness of it was almost unbearable. Even the simplest gestures of companionship, offering bread to a grieving widow or visiting a sick neighbor, felt like risks too great to take. Slowly, the village that had once thrived on its connections fell into isolation. Doors were shut and bolted. The old routines, the ones so tightly woven into daily life, began to fray and unravel completely. The market square, one of the liveliest hubs of the village, became eerily quiet. The merchants stopped coming. Stalls stood empty for days on end, until some toppled in the wind, their wooden frames collapsing into splintered heaps that no one bothered to right. The church offered little comfort. Fewer gathered for services, and when they did, they stood apart from each other, shoulders drawn tight as if even God's house could no longer guarantee safety. The ringing of the church bell, once a comforting rhythm, now sounded hollow, a painful reminder of loss each time it tolled. And through it all, winter rolled in. The snow, which once would have blanketed the earth in a kind of peaceful stillness, felt heavier this year. It muffled the world so completely that the absence of human life became even more pronounced. The paths that had always been worn smooth by countless feet grew slippery with ice, undisturbed for days at a time. The well at the center of the village froze over, its surface slick and cold to the touch, an image almost symbolic of the life now drained away. By the middle of winter, the village no longer felt like itself. It was something else entirely, a place defined less by its routines and more by the silence that followed them. Where children's laughter had once echoed, there was only the sound of wind rattling the empty shutters of abandoned homes. The forge, once warm and full of light, sat cold and dormant. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The communal ovens cracked under the weight of snow, their fires extinguished, the ever-present scent of fresh bread replaced by the sterile smell of winter air. Even among the survivors, there was a kind of stillness, a quiet that seeped into their very being. Those who had stayed away from others out of fear now found themselves alone, without the comfort of shared rituals to anchor them. They trudged cautiously through the snow-covered streets, glancing at each closed door and wondering how many of their neighbors were still alive. Some returned to the fields, attempting to salvage what little could be grown or foraged, but even this felt different. It was no longer a communal task, but a solitary one, performed without the hearty banter that once lightened the load. The arrival of the plague had transformed the village entirely. What was once a place defined by its shared spaces and bustling life now felt heavy with absence. And yet, there was something else. Too, a subtle thread of resilience that remained, even if it was nearly invisible. Amidst the despair, a few survivors lit their fires, gathered what food they could, and carried on, one day at a time. They moved cautiously, uncertain of what the future held, but with the faintest glimmer of hope that spring might bring something better. For now, though, the roads out of the village remained covered in snow, the horizon as still and quiet as the streets themselves. Winter didn't allow for escape, not yet. The people who remained would endure this season in the only way they could, isolated, grieving, waiting. And though their routines had crumbled and their lives had been stripped of the familiar, they still moved forward in small, careful steps. Those who survived would carry the weight of this winter with them long after the snow melted and the world began its slow, uneven recovery. The snow-covered streets seemed to stretch endlessly in their stillness, their once muddy, well-worn paths now untrampled and smooth. The village, so full of life mere months ago, felt hollow under the weight of winter and loss. Frost clung to the edges of empty windows, tracing intricate patterns on the glass where candlelight no longer flickered, and snow piled in thick drifts against doors that hadn't been opened in weeks. The wooden shutters that were once pushed open each morning stayed closed tight, as if trying to lock the emptiness inside. Even the air felt different, heavy, cold, and carrying none of the usual signs of life. No voices called out across the fields, and no laughter echoed from children playing near the square. Every sound seemed swallowed up by the snow. The absence of familiar noises was almost louder than sound itself. The ringing of the church bells had stopped entirely, where once they punctuated the day, marking prayers, meetings, and mealtimes. Now they were silent, their ropes stiff with frost, their bells unmoving. The blacksmith's forge, once alive with the bright clink of metal and the roar of fire, stood dark and cold, its anvil covered in a thin layer of snow. The air near the forge, which used to carry the sharp scent of smoke and coal, now smelled only of clean, sterile winter, sharp and empty. In the centre of the village, the well, once a bustling gathering point, had frozen completely. A thin layer of frost edged its stones, and its buckets sat discarded on the ground, the ropes stiff and brittle. No footsteps surrounded it. The snow lay pristine, untouched by even the suggestion of human activity. The homes told their own silent stories. Some bore marks of hurried departures, with doors left ajar, their hinges creaking faintly in the winter breeze. Others were locked tight, the remains of snow-covered firewood at their sides, telling of residents who had braved the cold as long as they could. Many were completely abandoned. Inside, the faint traces of lives once lived remained. A cooking pot left blackened over a now dead hearth. A child's carved wooden toy lying on the floor. It was as though time inside these homes had frozen alongside the well, leaving a snapshot of what life had been before everything unraveled. Winter's stillness carried its own weight, but the silence wasn't simply physical. It was the absence of connection, the disappearance of the hum that once defined the village. Merchants and craftsmen no longer stood at their stalls calling out to passers-by. The sharp bargaining of market days had faded into memory. In homes where several generations had once shared their meals, only a lone figure might now sit by a dim hearth, staring into the embers, as though trying to summon some comfort from its fading glow. Even the animals seemed subdued. Some barns stood eerily quiet, their livestock lost to the sickness or slaughtered in desperation for food. A handful of chickens still scratched at the snow, but their wandering shadows only deepened the sense of emptiness. This eerie quiet wasn't just unsettling, it played heavily on the minds of those who remained. Silence has a weight to it, one that settles into the bones over time. For a community like this one, where every life mattered, where people were deeply tied to one another for survival, the stillness was foreign and unbearable. Historical accounts suggest that survivors of the plague often described a sense of disbelief, as if the world had tilted off its axis, leaving them stranded in a space that felt both familiar and unrecognizable at once. Imagine walking through a village square, where every stone, every doorway looks as it always has, but the people, the heart of the place, are gone. The human spirit craves routine, familiarity, shared experience, and in the absence of these things, grief settles thickly, mingling with the unchanging cold of a winter sky. Yet, even amidst all this stillness, the faintest signs of persistence lingered. Here and there, a tendril of smoke rose from a chimney, a reminder that not everyone had been taken, Those left behind faced not only the physical devastation, but the emotional weight of rebuilding their days. Some tried to maintain the habits their lives had once revolved around, as though clinging to routine could tether them to a sense of normalcy. A woman might carry her wooden bucket to the frozen well, chipping and scraping to find water below the ice. A man might sit outside on a short broken bench, patching a hole in a pair of boots, even if he hadn't worn them beyond his own yard in weeks. These small acts of normalcy in a crumbling world were not just survival. They were defiance, a quiet insistence that life, even in its shattered form, could persist. The village priest, if he was still alive, likely struggled more than anyone to hold his fragile flock together. Without the ringing bell to summon them, congregants rarely gathered in the church. Fear of contagion had driven most people apart. And even when they did gather, the rituals that once provided solace felt thin and strained. The priest spoke his prayers with no choir to echo his chants, no congregation to murmur their amens. The hushed silence behind him must have felt like the loudest rebuke of all. He might have comforted himself with the thought that spring might bring more than flowers, that it might return the flock that had been scattered. But for now, winter's silence reigned, even in God's house. And as hard as it was to bear the isolation, grief itself seemed the hardest to carry. The survivors lived in the shadows of those they had lost, their absence imprinted everywhere. Entire households had been wiped out, their doors swinging in the biting wind. A mother who had once raised children alone now found herself childless. A farmer who had shared meals in the winter with his extended family now finished his bread alone, staring at empty stools. And while time stretched on, marked only by the slow passage of the sun across a grey sky, the survivors could do little more than endure. Take a moment to picture the streets one last time. The snowfall, undisturbed, lies thick on the ground. An abandoned cart sits on its side at the edge of the square, its wooden wheels frozen in place. The blacksmith's forge, once glowing with life, is dark, its tools left untouched. Just beyond the empty market stalls, far at the edge of the village, a figure moves, slow and methodical, their clothing lined with frost from the cold. They walk with a purpose, though it's unclear whether they're heading to another house to check on neighbours or simply pacing, needing to remind themselves that they are still alive. Their breath clouds the air before them as they trudge through a path they've broken in the snow many times before. This lone figure isn't just a survivor, they're a symbol. They move through a world transformed, bearing the weight of everything that has been lost, and yet they endure. Their footsteps echo faintly against the cold winter air, a fragile reminder that where there is movement, no matter how small, there is life. For now, what remains of the village clings to its sparse routines. The sound of a door cracking open, the sight of smoke swirling from a chimney, the lone shape of this villager moving slowly across the snow. They are small, but they are enough to keep the heart of the village beating, however faintly. And so, life persisted, if only in fragments. As winter wrapped the village in its final icy grip, the survivors found small ways to resist the silent desolation. A hand stretching out a piece of bread to a neighbor, a candle placed in a frost-covered window, its light barely noticeable against the thick grey of the day. These simple acts did not undo the darkness, nor did they erase the heavy quiet that settled thickly over the streets. But they hinted at something deeper, a refusal to surrender to the silence entirely. For those who remained, each day was its own challenge. The roads out of the village were impassable, the wider world reduced to snow-covered hills and endless skies. Here, in this still frozen place, the survivors began redefining what it meant to endure. The routines were gone, and the streets that had once defined their lives now served as reminders of all they had lost. Still, somewhere within the cold and quiet, life held on in its simplest, most fragile form. Imagine walking through the snow-covered streets of a medieval village in the winter of 1349. The air hangs still and cold, a sharp and biting chill that stings with every breath. But it wasn't just the frost cutting through the senses. The very air of the village, once filled with warmth and life, now seemed heavy, muted, and profoundly changed. If you stop for just a moment, you'd notice the absence of comforting scents, replaced instead by something strange and deeply unsettling. In a world where smell often shaped how people understood their surroundings, the changing air told its own story. In the years before the plague arrived, this village would have smelled alive. On brisk mornings, the aroma of freshly baked bread lingered in the square, carried from the communal ovens where villagers gathered to bake their loaves. Smoke curled from hearth fires in nearly every home, its rich, woody scent mixing with the earthy notes of livestock, the briny tang of sheep, the dusty warmth of hay, and the pungent yet familiar odour of the pigs penned near the edge of the village. During festivals, there may have been the sharp, sweet traces of honey cakes, or the herbal brightness of mead poured into wooden cups. Even the fields surrounding the village carried their own presence. The damp scent of turned soil and the faint floral hints of wild herbs growing along the edges. For the villagers, these smells weren't merely background. They were markers of normalcy, patterns rooted in the rhythm of their lives. The blacksmith's forge gave off its own distinct scent, a mix of hot metal and smoke that signaled the relentless hum of work. Inside homes, the faint musk of woolen blankets, cured meats hanging in corners, and the tang of simmering stews reinforced a sense of safety, a feeling of life contained and protected. Every breath taken here tied the villagers to their place, their community, and their route. But with the arrival of the plague, the air began to shift. Subtly at first, almost imperceptibly, as homes were sealed behind their shutters and the ovens grew cold. Those warm and familiar scents faded. The snow seemed to strip the village of its richness, leaving behind something sterile and stark. Cold air carried little scent, only the faintest whiff of dampness when it melted on skin. Once bustling pathways no longer smelled of animals or people moving through them. Instead, the clean, sharp smell of undisturbed snow filled the stillness. But it didn't stay like that for long. Soon, an unmistakable stench began to creep into the streets. Decay had a smell that couldn't be ignored, sharp and thick, pressing down on everything like a weight. The bodies of the deceased, often left untended for days, sometimes even weeks, began to outnumber the living. When burial pits filled faster than they could be dug, the stench of death lingered in the air, saturating the village in a way that no one could escape. It clung to the cold winds, filling homes and public spaces alike, an unrelenting reminder of how quickly life had unraveled, for those who remained alive to witness it. This transformation in the air wasn't just unsettling, it was terrifying. Smells carried meaning in medieval life, far more than we might think today. The idea of miasma, or bad air, dominated medieval understandings of disease. To them, sickness wasn't just something unseen, it was something you could sense, borne on the breeze, in the foulness of a room, or in the scent of rotting waste. It wasn't unusual for villagers to believe that the plague itself was carried in the very essence of these suffocating odours. And so they fought back the only way they could. With scent, herbs and flowers became a kind of weapon against the invisible enemy they feared. Lavender, rosemary, sage, plants with strong, clean aromas were thought to counterbalance the bad air. Some burned dried bundles of herbs in their hearths, filling their homes with the pungent fragrance of smoke mixed with sage or thyme. Others carried sprigs with them, tucking them into their clothing, or holding them close to their mouths as they ventured outside. Small bouquets, sometimes called nosegays, were not decorations. They were defences, clutched tightly, as though breathing their fragrant reassurance could somehow ward off the sickness. The association of scent with safety became deeply personal. For many, these herbal remedies may have been less about combating disease and more about creating a fragile sense of control. Imagine a woman standing at her doorway, holding a stem of mint under her nose, while looking out at the snow-covered fields her family once tended. That faint, cool smell might remind her of years past, when she'd plucked it fresh from her garden, blending it with her soups or teas. Now, it was a symbol of both hope and despair, a memory of normal times, and a shield against the decay creeping closer. Even professional efforts to counteract the plague revolved around smells. Plague doctors, dressed in their eerie, iconic masks with long, protruding beaks, filled those beaks with aromatic substances. Camphor, myrrh, rose petals, all were carefully stuffed inside, creating a barrier of supposed protection. These concoctions weren't chosen at random. Each had its own intense fragrance, pulled from the belief that pure, strong smells could fend off miasma. The irony, of course, is that while the theory was flawed, these practices likely provided some protection in an unexpected way. The dense layers, including the herbs in the masks, acted as a primitive filter, though it wasn't the sweet aromas doing the work. Yet for all their attempts to reshape their reality through scent, nothing could fully block the smells of death and despair. Walk through the streets during that winter, and you'd notice burned patches of ground where villagers had lit fires to cleanse the air, filling the sky with the acrid smell of soot and charred wood. You'd catch the bitter tang of ash, lingering where homes had been abandoned and their fires extinguished too late. In other corners, you might smell old wounds, a sticky, metallic blend of blood, sweat, and sickness where the sick remained huddled. And everywhere, just behind it all, the decay lingered, unrelenting, unmistakable. Smell, for the villagers, wasn't just a sensory experience. It was memory. It was connection. As the familiar smells of life faded further, the few who survived clung to them any way they could. A handful of lavender, held tightly in a pocket, could transport someone back to a day when it grew abundantly by the churchyard. Its scent carried on warmer winds. The faint smell of stale bread might remind one man of his mother's baking, her hands dusted with flour in the ovens that now sat cold. These fragile ties to the past offered solace, however brief, in a world where almost everything else had changed. And still, there were moments where that connection seemed impossible to reach. Picture an abandoned home, where the scent of burnt wood lingers faintly in the walls, long after the fire had gone out. Imagine a villager passing it on their way to the well, pausing in the snow, their heart catching at the thought of who used to live there. They wouldn't dare approach the door, knowing what might lie inside. But they would smell the air, and in it, they would find both loss and memory, the echoes of life before it turned. As you walk through the quiet streets, in your mind, picture this scene. A woman emerging from her home in layered furs and scarves to face the frozen world outside. Her breath clouds in the air as she steps carefully over the icy paths, her gloved hand clutching a simple sprig of lavender. She moves slowly, aware of how fragile each step feels, as though she's walking not just through snow, but through the weight of grief itself. That small sprig in her hand stands out vividly against the white, its soft purple petals both vivid and delicate. She carries it not for others to see, but for herself, for the faint smell it offers as she holds it to her face and breathes deeply. It's a small, quiet act, but in that moment, it's everything. A reminder, a resistance, a tiny, defiant gesture against the thick stench of decay all around her. The sense of the village had changed beyond recognition, each breath infused with grief, fear, and memory. Yet in small acts like these, in the clutching of a sprig of lavender, in the quiet burning of herbs in a hearth, survivors found a way to make the unthinkable bearable. The weight of change hung over every corner of that plague-stricken world. But in each familiar scent they managed to preserve, there was the faintest flicker of hope. A hope as fragile as the lavender petals in the woman's hand, but powerful enough to drive her forward into the empty streets, breathing deeply, step by step. In the heart of the village, just beyond the square, stood the communal well. It wasn't merely a place to draw water. It was the center of everything, a constant, enduring presence in the lives of those who called this village home. Each day, villagers passed by its weathered stone edge, ropes creaking as buckets dipped into the cool depths below. In the early hours of the morning, when the frost still clung to the thatched roofs, women gathered here with clay jugs balanced on their hips, their chatter weaving through the air. Conversations passed back and forth, blending laughter with worries about the next harvest or rumours brought by the occasional travelling merchant. Here, news spread faster than any runner across the countryside. The well was more than functional. It was an anchor. The water it provided sustained their lives, and the sense of shared purpose surrounding it strengthened their bonds. On a practical level, it gave life through water, for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. But its surroundings also played host to moments that connected neighbours. Children chased each other with wild abandon around its sturdy base, their shrieks of joy swirling into the air with the birdsong above. In the summer months, villagers paused to rest around the well's wide rim, seeking relief from their chores in its shade, exchanging quiet words, or simply enjoying the companionship of those who understood every corner of their lives. Even as winter drew in, frost crusting the ropes and mist curling up from the well's interior, it remained a gathering place. The villagers met here to offer spare firewood to those who might need it, or to fill buckets without worry about who pulled the rope last. Every turn of the handle reaffirmed the threads that tied them all together. The well stood as a symbol of the community's resilience, interdependence, and survival against the season's unpredictability. In medieval life, a well meant more than water. It meant life itself. The importance of its physical presence told a story as deeply rooted as the stones beneath the village. When the plague arrived, the well, and everything it represented, began to change. The fear that gripped the village was something new, and with fear came avoidance. Things that were once symbols of connection became objects of suspicion. Water, thought to be a life-giving element, carried an invisible threat. Whispers crept through the remaining townsfolk. Could disease rise from the depths? Could the act of drawing water pass this sickness from one hand to another? And as these questions took hold, the well, once central to life, began to see fewer and fewer visitors. The first signs of abandonment were small, fewer voices echoing around its open mouth, fewer buckets resting on its rim. Where women once passed one another small bouquets of herbs or handfuls of dried apples, there was now an uncomfortable emptiness. The children who had played around its base no longer appeared, their games silenced by sudden, unexplained absences in their homes. Gradually, the well stood more and more alone, watching as the village withdrew into itself. As winter set in, the neglect became more profound. Snow piled up around its edges, undisturbed for days, packed down not by steady footsteps, but only by the relentless winds, pulling silent drifts across the square. The bucket's rope stiffened with frost, while the rusty creak of its pulleys, once a constant refrain in the rhythm of village life, now faded into silence. The surface of the water below froze solid, its icy face reflecting back nothing but emptiness, and the faint filtered light through the opening above. The scene at the well mirrored what was happening throughout the village. Streets that had once been lively, hushed under layers of snow, and houses that had teemed with laughter and warmth now stood shadowed and forgotten. The village still relied on the well, at least in memory, but with fewer hands to tend to daily needs, and fewer to even remember the habits of how things had been. It transformed. No longer a hub of life, it became a marker of loss. The absence of people around it told a story that no words could capture. Every missing face, every unspoken greeting, every unused bucket spoke louder than any lament. The well wasn't alone in its transformation. Communal spaces like this held deep cultural and social significance in medieval communities. These were spaces where lives intersected. Every interaction, no matter how brief, existence itself was acknowledged and valued. Wells in particular played a crucial part in shaping a shared identity. A village well was a tangible reminder of how lives were connected, how resources were shared, and how survival depended on coming together rather than pulling apart. When the people vanished, the painful irony was that these spaces, once so important to communal strength, became stark testaments to its erosion. There's something haunting about the sight of a frozen well in the middle of winter. It's more than just a practical image. It's a metaphor, a physical reminder of something far larger. For the survivors, moving hesitantly through the snow-covered streets, it would have been difficult to look at the well and not feel the weight of everything it had come to represent. It stood both as an echo of life before the plague and as a reminder of the devastation that still hung in the air. A place that once symbolized shared resilience now reflected isolation. Where the act of drawing water had once required interaction, a shared task binding lives together, it now felt like a solitary affair. If someone approached the well at all, they'd likely do so alone, their steps crunching in the snow, their breath visible in the frosty air. Each draw of water would have felt heavier somehow, a quiet reminder of the hands that once helped turn the rope but were no longer there. Imagine standing at the edge of that well. Your gloved fingers grip the icy rope, and you pull. The sharp sensation of cold bites through your hand, but the physical effort feels familiar, comforting even in its ritual. As you haul up the bucket, you can't help but glance around. The square is empty. The windows of houses that once framed your neighbours' faces are dark, sealed shut, or frosted over inside and out. As the water splashes faintly against the bucket's sides, you hear nothing but your own breath and the soft rustle of wind against snow. The stillness presses in on you. The well stood as a constant reminder that life, as fragile as it may seem, clung on. Despite everything, its stones still held strong. Even when the bucket froze in place or the snow piled too high to approach it easily, it waited. Long after the bells stopped ringing and the voices faded into quiet, the well remained, not as it once was, but still there. It bore witness to everything. The lives it had helped sustain, the hands that had gripped its edge in warmer seasons, the ceremonies it had watched, and the stories it had overheard. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been part of the rhythm of life. By the winter of 1349, though, much of that rhythm was lost. The roads that had once brought wagons of supplies from neighbouring towns were blocked by snow and shadowed by fear. The village itself had emptied of sound, save for the occasional faint crunch of a survivor making their way to collect what they needed to last another day. Each time they passed the well, its quiet presence reminded them of what had been. They may have thought about old festivals, when garlands of flowers hung from its ropes in early spring, or moments of joy as children splashed and played at its base on hot summer afternoons. Now, there was no garland, no splash, no joy, just cold stone and a silence that felt unending. Yet, in this stillness, the well also carried another quality: endurance. Its existence, even in its frozen and unused state, spoke to something beyond loss. At the edge of the desolation, it reminded the survivors that some things, at least, could remain. Its frost-covered surface and the absence of rushing hands and bustling voices didn't erase the fact that it had witnessed centuries of continuity before this rupture. The frozen silence of the well, and of the village as a whole, wasn't final, not entirely. Think of the well as it likely appeared in that moment, its stone rim encircled by untouched snow, its pulley creaking faintly in the wind. Left alone for weeks or months, it stood as a quiet monument, a memory frozen in time. To those who dared to linger, it must have felt profoundly haunting, yet slightly comforting all at once. Beneath its frozen surface, the water was still there. Life, though hidden, persisted, just as it did in the hearts of the few who remained. Even in its stillness, even half buried in snow, the well stood as a fragile yet enduring link between what was lost and what might one day return. It's in this tension, between fragility and resilience, memory and presence, that the well found its new meaning. It became more than a practical tool or even a communal space. It became a symbol, not of what was gone, but of what quietly endured, weathering the snows and freezing winds along with the survivors themselves. And like those who trudged past it in the icy gloom, it bore the weight of the past while it waited, silent. Imagine life in a small medieval village where every day unfolded with the comforting repetition of shared routines. Farmers rose with the sun, their hands blistered but steady as they turned the soil for planting. Bakers collected bundles of firewood for the communal ovens, kneading dough by the warm orange glow of the fire before the village awoke. The church bell rang at dawn, ushering in prayers and marking the steady rhythm of time. These routines weren't just tasks, they were the bedrock of the villagers' lives. Each role was meaningful, connected to the next in the delicate web of survival. But by the winter of 1349, that web had unraveled. Familiar routines that once defined the days were gone, replaced by hesitation and loss. Farming, essential for feeding the village, often couldn't be carried out. Too many hands were missing. Brothers who had harvested and ploughed alongside one another, fathers who had hauled carts of wheat. Those who were left didn't know whether to plan for another spring or simply wait out a winter that seemed unending. The fields, blanketed in snow and frost, lay dormant, not by the natural order of the seasons, but because the sweat and labour once poured into them had stopped. Without the comforting cadence of planting and harvest, the heartbeat of the village slowed to something faint, unsteady. The bakers' ovens, always the warm centre of life, were quiet. Bread, so vital to every meal, had become scarce. Where women once gathered to knead dough and chat about the day, only silence hung in the cold air. Some villagers still baked, of course, those who had survived with strength enough to continue. But it was different now. Instead of the lively hum of voices and the laughter of children clinging to their mothers' skirts, the ovens were still and shadowed, their fires lit sparingly. Without flour coming in from neighbouring farms or markets, even baking became a struggle. Instead of hearty loaves to share, some families made do with flatbread, stretching precious handfuls of grain into meals meant to last much longer than they should. The church too had changed, and with it, the rhythms of faith that once guided their lives. Sunday services were no longer a gathering of the whole village. With fewer living priests and rumours of plague spreading through the touch of another's hand or the shared air inside the church, many stayed away altogether. The bells that once rang out a declaration of community, calling villagers together for prayer, baptisms, marriages, now seemed to only toll for funerals. And those funerals came in numbers too great to honour fully. Where solemn processions through the village and individual burials with blessings were tradition, the churchyards now held mass graves. Rituals of faith, once so grounding, felt hollow in the face of so much death. For many, their faith itself was shaken. The prayers that no longer seemed to stem the tide of sickness and loss, leaving an emptiness for survivors. The loss of these routines left a deep emotional impact. In times of crisis, routines provide stability, a sense of control over the uncontrollable. Without them, grief and fear began to fill every unoccupied moment. The familiar noises of the village, bare feet on frozen dirt, the clink of tools, the sing-song calls of greetings, were replaced by quiet, by absences too great to comprehend. For those who had lived through the plague, life hadn't just changed externally. The world they understood, one built on predictable rhythms, seemed to have collapsed, leaving behind only the question of how to carry forward. Yet humans have an incredible ability to adapt, even in the face of profound loss. Though the routines that defined normal life had crumbled, survivors found quiet, piecemeal ways to recreate them. Something as small as kneading dough could become an act of resilience, providing a sense of structure, a refusal to entirely surrender to chaos. A baker might still rise before the rest of the village, gathering what scant flour remained just to make one loaf. The warm steam of bread, fresh out of the oven, was a small defiance, a statement that life, though diminished, had not disappeared completely. Those who remained tried to keep fragments of their normal days intact, one motion at a time. A farmer, trudging through the snow-covered fields, might scatter what little grain he had left, not because the ground would yield a plentiful harvest come spring, but because the act itself tied him to the years before. A blacksmith, even with few tools left to repair and not enough orders to forge, might spend hours sharpening his remaining blades, preparing for needs that no longer existed. These small acts, seemingly purposeless in their isolation, held significance. They allowed survivors to tether themselves to patterns they could still recognize, even as the world itself remained unrecognizable. Through historical records, we see how crucial these routines were to maintaining stability. Villages centered their entire existence on shared labor, religious observance, and ritual. When these were disrupted, the effects rippled far beyond the practical. Loss of routine stole away the village's sense of unity, its confidence in the future. Imagine losing not only your family and neighbors, but the daily structures that made up your understanding of life. To grind flour, to light a fire, to pray, these weren't just physical actions, they were markers of identity and belonging. In the absence of larger festivals, markets, or celebrations, even small gatherings became treasured. There might be fewer people now to meet at the well or by the ovens, but a glance, a murmured greeting, or an exchange of bread or salt could create a small thread of connection. In a mostly empty square, the sight of one neighbor walking past could remind survivors that not everything had vanished. These fleeting encounters, while understated, were like echoes of what the village once was, faint but still audible. What's remarkable is how even altered routines offered a sense of hope. Though the rhythms were quieter and the spaces emptier, there was still life moving forward. In fits and starts, yes, but forward nonetheless. The small flicker of a morning fire in a cabin window, the sound of one horse's hooves crunching on snow as a farmer checked his fences. These were reminders that survival itself could become ritual. Not all routines were performed out of necessity anymore. Some were practiced solely to keep the threads of the past from completely unraveling. The baker, for instance, might have worked in solitude now, but their craft carried more weight than ever. Imagine a lone figure in the early morning, kneading dough in a darkened home, the heavy silence broken only by their hands, pressing and folding the mixture into form. The fire in the oven crackles softly, warming the room and illuminating the dust-laden air. Outside, the snow builds silently, blanketing everything in cold, white stillness. But here, amid the faint aroma of rising bread, there is a flicker of persistence. Placing a loaf on the windowsill to cool, the baker would feel the weight of the loss around them, but also the pull to keep going. Other homes, those routines took on new meanings. Lighting a candle at dusk became not just a practical necessity, but an act of commemoration, a quiet reflection for those who were no longer there to do it themselves. Sweeping the hearth or mending a torn garment wasn't simply tending to the space, it was reaching back toward a version of life that was slipping further from memory, like trying to grasp a phantom before it faded completely. There are stories, too, of acts of generosity amidst this shrinking world. Bread left on a doorstep, a bundle of kindling shared with a neighbor, herbs tucked into cracks of a doorframe as protection. While the plague fractured communities, it also brought moments of quiet solidarity. Survivors leaned on each other where they could, despite the fear that defines so much of life now. Small gestures, offered food, shared prayers, breathed life back into routines long thought lost. As you picture the village, its routines now stripped and pared down to their barest forms. Imagine the baker again. They kneel by the fire early in the evening, watching a second loaf bake, a small offering to an elderly neighbor who can no longer leave their home. As the room fills with warmth and the smell of bread, the baker wraps the loaf in cloth, careful and deliberate before stepping out into the snow. The air is sharp but quiet, each step crunching underfoot. The walk, once just a simple route through the square, now holds weight with each step, echoing with memory and purpose. When the loaf is left on the neighbor's doorstep, the act is personal, almost sacred. It's more than bread. It's survival, connection, life, made tangible in the simplest way. And that's where we leave things, not with the comforting hum of the village as it once was, but with its faint echoes. These routines, quieter now, and scattered like fading embers, were proof that even in the hardest winter, humans sought to preserve meaning. They were remnants of a life that might never return in full, but the fact that they continued in any form was its own kind of hope, a faint warmth against the bitter snow. In the darkest grip of winter, when survival seemed more fragile than ever, even the smallest gestures of humanity became acts of hope. For the survivors of the Black Death, enduring wasn't just about finding food or shelter. It was about holding on to the things that made life recognizable, bearable, even in the face of overwhelming loss. These small acts, sharing a meal, lighting a candle, singing a song, carried a quiet defiance, a refusal to give in completely to despair. The streets were nearly silent, but they weren't lifeless. If you looked closely, you might see traces of this persistence. Small, carefully chosen actions that gave survivors a reason to move forward. Imagine a woman stepping out into the cold, cloaked to keep out the frost as much as the fear. In her hands, she clutches a few slices of bread, coarse, plain, the last remnants of her meager supplies. She walks to a neighbor's door, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the snow. There is no grand announcement, no exchange of words. She simply leaves the bread on the step and walks away, her gesture a quiet acknowledgement. You are not alone. For the neighbor who would find it later, it was more than food. It was a thread of connection in an unraveling world. Even the act of lighting a candle grew heavier with meaning. In homes where families had once gathered by the hearth, only one or two figures remained, each a shadow of what the household used to be. Lighting a flame symbolized more than illumination. It was an act of remembrance and resilience. A single candle placed in a frost-covered window wasn't just for practical light. It was a soft, flickering reminder against the darkness. It was for those who were lost, for those watching from afar, for oneself. In the silent hours of the night, that gentle glow became a sign that someone was still there, still holding on. Despite its devastation, the Black Death couldn't fully extinguish the human impulse to care for others. In one village, a healer moved from house to house, her hands rough from grinding herbs and roots. She carried bundles of rosemary, sage, and dried lavender, scents believed to ward off sickness. She entered homes cautiously and without ceremony, offering whatever comfort she could, even though she knew she had no true cure to offer. A mother, exhausted from tending to her fevered child, would look up at her arrival with the quietest glimmer of relief. For the healer, the herbs she carried weren't just for protection against pestilence. They were fragments of life before the plague, small reminders of gardens once green, of health that once felt certain. These gentle moments of connection were crucial. They provided balance against the relentless grief filling every corner of life. For those who received an act of kindness, a shared loaf, a handful of dried apples, a whispered prayer, they were temporary reprieves from the solitude that surrounded them. And for those performing these acts, the giving itself became a kind of salvation. In caregiving and ritual, they found a fragile sense of control, a way to make their own survival meaningful. Grief took its own form in this winter of silence. Snow lay thick across the graveyards, but these resting places were not marked with careful stones and tender care as they would have been before. The sheer toll of the plague left many graves shallow and hastily dug, bodies buried in layers when the hands to dig them grew too few. Yet even here, survivors found ways to honor the dead. It wasn't a grand ritual, it was quiet, personal, a woman leaving a sprig of rosemary at the edge of a pit, a young man, the last of his family, marking the frozen earth above his mother's resting place with a makeshift cross, fashioned from 2 broken branches. These moments were not about grand gestures. They were about creating meaning in a world that seemed to have none. The very act of storytelling took on new importance as survivors struggled to process what was happening around them. In one village, a poet composed a lament describing the black wind that had stolen their loved ones away. His verses painted vivid images of devastation, yet they echoed a shared pain, one that connected him to his neighbors, even as death forced them apart. Storytellers, whether through lament, folklore, or whispered prayers, offered a thread of connection to the familiar. The stories remembered life before the disease and spoke, cautiously, of what might follow. They were not tales of optimism, but their very existence showed an innate human need to reach for understanding, even in incomprehensible times. To speak of wounds, after all, is to acknowledge one's ability to feel and to endure. These small acts of kindness and shared rituals were, in their own way, a quiet defiance against the plague itself. Sharing a loaf of bread, lighting the single candle, or composing a lament were acts that stood in stark contrast to the sickness that sought to isolate and destroy. They were not grand or transformative, but they allowed survivors to retain something profoundly human: connection. When one villager left a loaf on a doorstep or bundled sticks of firewood for a neighbor, they were not simply fighting the cold or the emptiness. They were reminding themselves, and one another, that they hadn't been entirely hollowed out by grief. A psychological perspective, these small acts held immense power. Historians and researchers studying crises have found that routines, gestures, and rituals provide a sense of stability in even the most chaotic environments. The survivors of the Black Death, though they had no science to lean on, instinctively understood this. By continuing to bake bread, tend to graves, or light candles, they reaffirmed their purpose, even when they felt surrounded by purposelessness. Rituals gave structure to their days. Acts of kindness reminded them of their humanity, and moments of silence with a flickering candle offered peace, no matter how brief. There is a story within every one of these moments. A baker rising early to knead what little flour remains, a child running through the snow to deliver herbs to the priest, a neighbor carving wooden toys for orphaned children. Tiny, fleeting decisions to offer hope, comfort, warmth. Each gesture was a step toward renewal, no matter how small. These acts, when taken together, became the foundation for recovery. They began to rebuild some sense of community, even when it felt as if so much had been lost. Picture one home among the many in this snow-shrouded village. Its timbers are frosted over, its roof weighed down by the passing storm. Inside, a single candle burns on a windowsill. Its light doesn't reach far, just faintly illuminating the snowflakes that drift past. To someone walking through the village square on a quiet night, that candle might seem small and insignificant. But it's not. It is a signal, a sign of life. Inside, someone is alive and holding on. Maybe they are grieving, or praying, or sitting silently, but they have lit the flame as a reminder to the world outside that life persists here, subtle as it may be. That light dares to push back against the cold and the darkness. In moments like this, you can see the resilience of the human spirit at work. These small, deliberate acts offered no cure for the plague, no reversal of the damage it had caused, but they did something equally profound. They became a way to endure. The woman who left the bread on the doorstep might not have known her neighbor's fate. The young man marking his mother's grave could have been the last to do so before the ground froze solid. And the healer, crossing the square with her bundle of herbs, couldn't have been sure her efforts would make a difference. Still, they acted, not because they believed these gestures would change the world, but because in them they found the strength to carry on. It's through these small acts that survivors planted the earliest seeds of recovery. They didn't know what the future would hold. They couldn't imagine the years ahead when life would become stable once again, when fields would yield full harvests and laughter would return to the square. But they reached for hope in whatever form they could find it, knowing it might be fragile, but knowing too that it mattered. These moments, quiet, intentional, utterly human, allowed them to begin stitching threads of life back together. You think of this village in the winter of 1349, don't picture it simply as a place consumed by silence and suffering. It was those things, of course, but it was also a place where resilience flickered in the smallest of ways. A single loaf of bread, a quietly whispered story, a sprig of herbs left outside a grieving child's home, and above all, that candle in the window, burning softly against the night, not to fight against the snowfall or the winds, but simply to say that within these walls someone remembers, someone grieves, and someone hopes. The Black Death shattered medieval life, but from its devastation came profound change. Survivors, though burdened by loss, shaped the future. Their resilience challenged old systems, leading to new economies and ways of thinking. As feudal ties unraveled, opportunities emerged, altering Europe's social structure forever. These shifts remind us of the enduring strength within people to rebuild after tragedy. Science, posting keys, toe. Now, consider your own world. Those small, everyday connections. Shared meals, moments of kindness, are the threads that hold life together. Even history's darkest moments teach us this. Hope grows in the quietest acts. What might our own small gestures inspire tomorrow?